Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. A few weeks ago, I did a class on essential endgames for beginners, and I kind of wanted to follow up with that class because there are just so many technical endgames that are so useful to know and so important to know. And I wanted to go through some more of those tonight. Of course, this is immediately following the Road to 2000 lecture on insane material imbalances. If you didn't catch that one, I would encourage you to go back and see that because it was a lecture with some really fun games, some of my favorite games. But in honor of that lecture, I am going to be going over the most imbalanced endgame I can think of that's still interesting, which is, of course, the queen versus pawn endgame. And obviously, this is one that many of you may already know, but I think everyone would agree this is one of the essentials. And if you do already know it, it can't hurt to have a little bit of a refresher course on it. And I am going to introduce some pretty fun puzzles at the end. So if you think you know these endgames well, stick around for the end and see if you can pass the little tests I have prepared for you guys. So, to start off with here, we are looking at this with the black pieces in this case. And it's black to move in this position. Now, don't be fooled. If the pawns were going this way, this would be the easiest win of all time for black. You just bring the king in and win the game. But here, the pawns are not going this way. The pawn is going this way and is just one little itty-bitty step from making a queen for white and drawing the game. Of course, queen versus queen, you're never really going to be able to outplay another person with such little material on the board. So if black wants to win this game, black has to find some way to stop this pawn. So now I'm sure a lot of people in the chat are aware of the winning strategy in this case already, but let's talk it through. How can black ever try and win this game against a pawn that is just one step away from queening? How can we do it? What do you think, chat? Aryan has very enigmatically told me the check procedure. Are you guys aware of the check procedure? I'm assuming he is not talking about the process by which a waiter or waitress will come to the table, take the check, bring it back, wait for the card, that kind of thing. Although that may be even more complicated than this chess endgame. So, of course, the idea, as people are mentioning here, is that the queen alone is actually not enough to win any of these positions. What do I mean by that? Well, the king is always going to be able to make threats of promoting the pawn, and the queen is never going to be able to just stick somewhere and say, all right, that's it. I have stopped this pawn from promoting permanently. Now I can go about winning the game. So the point is, if you get to this type of position and you just try to check forever with the queen or try to get in front of the pawn somehow, you're not going to make any progress. Let's just take a look at that and see if that is true. So for example, queen f2 check, king e8, check, check, check. If we check from the first rank, king f7, we're never going to be able to play a move like queen g8, blockading this pawn and getting it out of our way to win the game, right? That's just not going to happen. So what can we do? How can we ever win these positions, right? How do you ever win here? How can you pin? No, black will go here. It seems as if black cannot ever win, right? We just go around chasing each other in circles for hours and hours and hours, and the second we try to step closer, white is going to queen. So, how do we actually win? Well, the point is, there's actually a bit of a trick black can use to gain one move at a time. You can spend that one move to get your king closer, and then when your king is super, super close to the pawn, you can just take with the queen, and your king's there for backup, and you can win the game. That is the essential idea. So what's the secret? How do you gain this extra time to move your king closer? Well, it turns out black can actually force the white king to a very specific square, and the second the white king lands on that square, black can start to advance his own king closer. What square is that? Well, of course, it is the g8 square. Whenever the white king lands on g8, this is black's prime opportunity to step closer with the king. Why is that? Well, when the king is on g8, this pawn obviously cannot legally promote with its own king standing in the way. So how do we actually force the king to g8? Well, you start by bringing the queen a little bit closer to the king. It turns out the queen, using its diagonal properties as well as its forward-looking properties, can make some tangible threats against both the king and the pawn, and those threats force the king back to g8. So let's start by getting the queen as close as we can. White should actually step away from the pawn here, which might not be expected. The point being, if he steps to g8 here, black steps closer. So he wants to stay away from the pawn so that black no longer has time to do this, or else he'll be met with queens. So king e7, for example, we can step closer one rank at a time. King f7, queen f4, king g6, for example, queen g4. King f6 or h6 would be a bit of a mistake because then again, the black king can step closer. We haven't threatened a queen with white. We need the king to defend that square. So king h7, for example. Now queen h5 check, stepping even closer, and the king is forced back to the g8 square. If he goes this way, for example, trying a bit harder, we step even closer with the queen, king e7, and then what is the key move here? What is the key move here? It's actually time to stop checking the white king. We want to get our queen as close as possible, and now we can no longer do that by giving checks, right? These are our only two real useful checks, and neither of those advance the queen closer. So what's the big idea here? And yeah, the chat room already has it. The idea is queen g6, stepping even further up the board, continuing our little zigzag and getting finally to the rank directly behind the pawn. Of course, now white cannot queen because the king had stepped away from the pawn, and so king f8 is forced. And now finally, the winning idea for black is you go queen f6 check, and the point now is we are giving the same check we've given a million times before, but thanks to the diagonal power of the queen, we are also hitting this pawn on g7. White can no longer step away from the pawn, or else it will be captured. So king g8 is forced. Now black can step closer with king to e2. White can try to escape again, but it's not going to be any good. There are many ways to get the king back to g8 now, using the same checking procedure. Works just fine. Stepping back to the file checks, right? Same idea. The exact same sequence there. I know I played through it pretty fast. We give this check. Now king h6 or f6 doesn't work because we can step closer. King h7 means queen h5. King steps to g8. Queen f7 means queen f5. The king should step away. And now the key move again, queen g6. The exact same idea we saw before. And queen f6 check. Now it turns out there is actually a bit of a faster way to do this if you are curious. Once you get the queen this close, the move queen f7 is actually much faster. And the point now is if king h6, then queen g8 is good. Also the simple move king f3. And if king h8, we can immediately go queen h5, and king g8 is going to be forced once again. Of course, queening here is highly illegal. It won't even let me do it because the pawn is pinned to the king. So we'll stick with this idea. And then we step even closer. King f8 means this move. And the key move again here, queen g6, queen f6 check. And king g4 now, king h7. And here there's actually a very interesting idea for black. You can go one step even closer using the same ideas we just looked at with something like this. But perhaps the simplest in this case is to just play this move, king to h5, and the point now is that white is unable to queen due to checkmate. And if white tries to make a knight and be super tricky, queen f7, king h8, king g6, and now no matter where this knight goes, either checkmate and one will be played, like this, or knight e7 check. We have to capture, but thankfully by capturing, we have given the king a flight square, and we'll play checkmate. But if you're looking for simplicity, then the same pattern will do you good here. King g8, king f5. And here, if you want to get the king even closer, you can play this move, queen h6, pinning the pawn to the king. King f7, for example, you can go queen f6 check once again, king g8, king g6, and now the pawn never even gets to promote. You just take and win with your king as close as possible. So what did we just do? From the starting position, well, we used this checking idea in this key move of queen g6 using the diagonal power of the queen to pressure both the pawn and the king at the same time. And whenever the king steps in front of the pawn, and I mean whenever the king steps in front of the pawn, we bring our king closer and closer and closer until eventually we can deliver checkmate on the g7 square. So any questions about this idea before we move on to another example of it? No questions. All right, perfect. No questions. And by the way, if you're one of those more beginner level players who watches these lectures and is a little bit too scared to type in the chat, now's your chance. This lecture is not for Chess King. It's not for Aryan Gutla. It's for you. It's for the beginners out there. Does pinning work better than king f8? Okay, so H or A file. So we're going to go through all the pawns on all the files. Don't worry. But for now, let's stick with this one winning one. Questions about it here. Is it for you, Great Wolf? I don't know. Do you consider yourself to be a beginner? It's tough. Does pinning work better than king f8? So I'm not entirely certain what you're talking about, Aniruda. In general, the only pins I was mentioning were these ideas. Sorry, not those ideas. Let's make that the main line. This idea of going queen f7 here to pin the pawn to the king, it is sort of the fastest way. And so if you want to say better, then you can say queen f7 is faster. I wouldn't call it better because both ways win. And if you really just want to stick with the checking idea, you are more than welcome to do so with queen back to h4 and giving this check and getting back to queen g6 like this, right? And once again, advancing the king. This is a perfectly fine way to do it. Don't let anybody tell you that because your way is slower, it is worse. The best checkmate is always the one that you see. So if you're confident with this, then you are confident with this. Can I go over it again? So we're going to go over a very similar situation here with the pawn on the center of the board. And in fact, some might say this is even simpler because you don't have to even think about running out of space on the sides of the board as you would with a knight pawn. So this position is actually going to be winning with the exact same method that we just took a look at. We want to force the king in front of the pawn and then bring our king closer step by step by step. So how can we force the king in front of the pawn? Well, it's the same idea as last time. We need the king close to the king and the pawn so that its diagonal powers will actually be useful. Right now, its diagonal powers pretty useless to us, actually. They don't really do much. There's no way of these diagonal moves influencing the king and the pawn. But the second we get super, super close, we see that a queen on d6, for example, would pressure both the d file and the e7 pawn at the same time. So we need to get close. How do we get close? Well, we check the king up the board. By the way, in these positions, you can give this check to come further up, or you can actually just go queen e3 as well, because you're stopping the pawn from queening by defending it. The king has to come back to defend. We come closer, say king c7. We can come closer, king d7. Now, we can't come closer immediately, or else white would queen, but we can give this check, king c7, and then the key move here, once again, is stepping closer whenever we can, stopping the pawn from queening, and also forcing the king to the back rank now. And finally, queen d6, and we have achieved this diagonal power that we were looking for. King c8, not playable because of queen takes e7. And so once we're here, it becomes pretty simple. We come forward. White must try to escape, and we can go back now to the same ideas we were looking at with these checks, right? The king can step away, but we will step forward. and here, and queen e6 is the key idea. Once again, always stepping forward whenever possible. By the way, the same pinning idea that we looked at last time does actually also work here with queen d7, pinning the pawn to the king. We can check. King can't step in front of the pawn, remember, and then queen back to e6. And bam, queen f6 check. Same predicament for the white king. Cannot step to the side, so king e8, and now king c3. And at the end of the day, black is going to get the queen, going to get the king right up close and personal and win the game. The same idea we've seen before. Queen e6, the key move, then queen f6, forcing the king to make a decision, has to step in front of the pawn. Now king c5, we'll say. King d7, we can even just go queen d6 check immediately. King e8. I guess king c6 might be the simplest now, bringing the king as close as possible. And finally, at the end of the day, queen f5 check, king e8, king d6, only one legal move for white, and we can give checkmate. So the tricky bits usually happen around here when the king is super, super close, and here you just have to rely on a little bit of calculation. I don't think it's worth trying to memorize what to do exactly with the king when you get this far. Just try and calculate a little bit. The only thing you have to look out for, well, number one, of course, is not letting them queen for free, and number two is making sure you do not stalemate the white king, as there is some potential for that here. For example, the worst move on the board, bar none, is this move is technically the worst move on the board. This move is also pretty bad, but king c7 is a close third with stalemate on the board. I always have to be sure I'm telling the truth when I say worst move on the board, otherwise people will be sure to correct me. So king c7 would be pretty bad with stalemate. King d6, though, would win the game, giving the king a square with checkmate to follow. So, once again, any questions on this technique? Any questions on this technique? So AZ says this technique would be very difficult to apply in Blitz with 5 seconds on the clock. Well, luckily in time scrambles, you don't have to try to win the pawn. You just have to try to check the white king as many times until your opponent runs out of time. If you play this endgame perfectly, is there an initial position where you draw due to the 50 moves rule? Absolutely not. You are always able to get to the pawn in time. In fact, I'm showing sort of the absolute worst examples with the king here on the A1 square. What's the exact... it looks like, I do have a table base here. It looks like with the king on A1, the distance to capturing the pawn or checkmate is 44 half moves, which is 22 moves. So much time to spare. All right. So then let us move on to the other type of this kind of endgame. So far we have seen what happens with the pawn on the quote-unquote knight's file, meaning the G file, and the ideas here are the same as the pawn on the B file. Because the chessboard is symmetric, the ideas don't really change. We've seen what happens with the E pawn, and of course here the ideas are going to be exactly the same for the D pawn. It changes literally nothing. The chessboard being symmetric once again takes care of that. But now, what happens with the bishop's pawn? This one is a little bit more complex. And actually, I lied. We're going to look at that next. First, let's look at what happens with the rook's pawn. This pawn being on a rook file, meaning either the H file or the A file. And the idea is, again, sort of transfer because the chessboard is super symmetric. And what happens here? What do you guys think? Can black win this position? Is there something wrong with our technique? So yeah, of course, the same technique is not going to work here. White is actually in a bit of a fortress. It's impossible to win this position if white plays it well, and white doesn't even have to play it that well. White can usually just sort of, play only moves and then draw the game. So why doesn't the same idea work? Well, let's go ahead and try it. Let's get our queen up close and personal to the white king. It turns out we can actually force him to step to the h8 square. But the problem is, the second the king steps to h8, we cannot actually advance our king. Why is that? Well, because the game has just ended in a stalemate. Of course, the king runs out of squares. In the other examples we looked at, this would be the point where the king steps one square to the right, and we check him back in front of the pawn, advance our king further, and then we would continue doing so until our king is super close. However, here we only get to play one king move, and then the game ends by stalemate. And there's actually just no tricky way around this. You can't even try to trick the opponent into, it not being stalemate. It's always going to be a stalemate here. And for example, you can never really get this position with the queen on a square like h6, for example, or e6, because you just can't force the king to h8. For example, let's say you get this position and play queen e6 check. Here, if king h8 is played, then that would be great. You can come forward, you can step up and advance. But white can play either king g7 or king f8. Neither of these moves are bad, and both of them threaten to queen, meaning black can make no progress, right? And if you get this position, let's say somehow you get this position with the queen on h6, well then white can simply promote, right? It'd be great if he was forced to move the king here in either direction. Then black would be able to make progress or take the pawn. But of course, white can simply queen. And so, I will say, in the normal case, where the black king is super far away, this endgame is going to be a draw. And we're going to look at the exceptions to that a little bit later in the lecture. And that's where things get a bit complicated. But this is the simple version, right? In general, when the black king is far away, these endgames are always going to be a draw if the pawn is on the A file or the H file. And once again, we're going to take a look at some exceptions to this idea. But first, let's talk about the bishop's pawn. So, what is going on with the bishop's pawn? It seems like, yeah, obviously, the rook pawn, there's these weird things where you run out of board space and the king gets stalemated. But surely we would be able to win with the f pawn. Where is surely? Somebody gets surely. No, never mind. Okay, why can't we win against a bishop pawn? I'm revealing the answer. You cannot win here. But why is that the case? Why bishop pawns? It seems so random, right? Like knight pawns are winning, center pawns are winning, rook pawns, they're weird, who cares? But bishop pawns, surely we could win. Surely we could win against the bishop pawns. But I guess not. And yeah, the chat already knows. The issue here is that this darned h8 square still manages to get itself involved, regardless of whether we want it to or not. And so once again, the king is going to run out of space on the h file. How does this happen? Well, let's start by getting our queen closer, as we have in the past. King h7, for example. Previously, queen f6 here is the key move, getting the queen closer whenever possible. But now king g8. Queen g6, and historically, this has been where white either goes away from the pawn and loses the pawn, or steps in front of the pawn and we advance with the king. However, in this case, after king h8, our idea that we relied on is being able to capture the pawn in this case, and if we capture the pawn, this stupid h8 square is involved again, and this is in fact stalemate. And it's sort of one of the great crimes against chess that black has no way to make any progress here, but black has no way to make any progress here. It seems super unfair. I know, right? Like, you've got this queen, all this guy's got is this one little pawn, all you need to do is bring your king, but this one stalemate trick, there's just no way to get around it. It's sort of ridiculous. So, once again, in this simple case, when the black king is super far away, this position is going to be just a dead draw. There's no way to make progress here. White will always step to the corner and never step in front of the pawn if he knows what he's doing. Of course, if he doesn't know what he's doing, then you might still have a chance to win this game with this idea. They might get scared of going king h8, play king f8, and then you step closer with the king as you have in the past. So useful to know as the defender as well. King h8, the drawing idea with the bishop's pawn. And once again, this is completely symmetric. On the other side of the board, the king would step to a8, and the same stalemate idea would be appearing. Okay, though, let's start talking about all of the nuances with the rook pawn. All right? So in the first case, we looked at the rook pawn, in this case, with the king way back here on d1 and the rook pawn up here on h7. But taking a look here, things are a little bit different, right? There's a big difference between d1 and d5 for this king. So, chat room, do you know the answer to this one? Is d5 close enough for black to win this game, or do we need to be a little bit closer? Just a little bit closer. You tell me. Can black win here? And then I will go into some of the explanation as to why. And this is something that I've actually seen explained before, but it was very confusing when I saw other people explain it. So I'm going to give you a sort of new idea here, see if it helps. Grey Wolf has a great little mnemonic device. If you put the HACF files together, it almost spells half, as in half point for draw. If only the C was an L, but close enough. It's a fun one, something I have not seen before. Okay, and finally, our super strong chat room is divided. Chess King says yes, then he says wait, no. Peter Peterson says probably one step too far away. Shalene says you're close enough. Chess King says king on d4 is a draw. Danilo says he'd say no, but he's also bad. Good to know. Dinesh says can't win. Sahil says it's a draw. Believe it or not, black is completely winning again. Well, as long as it's black to move. Of course, if it's white to move, white makes the queen. But black to move, this position is totally winning. Why is that? Well, historically, when I've seen this explained, people have highlighted all these squares and said, yeah, if your king is on any of these squares, then you win the game, right? But I think that's silly. How are you going to remember, what is this, 9 squares plus 14, 8? How are you going to remember 18 squares, right? That's ridiculous. So what I remember is if the king can step to one of these 4 squares for black, then black is going to be winning. And this, I think, is a better way to remember it because black has checkmating ideas if the king can get to any of these squares. And those checkmating ideas win the game. So if you remember, at the beginning of the lecture, I briefly mentioned, black can be sort of fancy and just checkmate white right off the bat with the king being this close, rather than just trying to directly win the pawn. And now, black actually has to rely on being fancy because his king is so far away. So, chat, how do we actually win? How do we get to one of these squares and win the game? Does anybody know the line here for black? Great Wolf says, oh look, corresponding squares. Not quite. Historically, that's like all I use these circles for, but now this one is nothing to do with corresponding squares. So yeah, Lane Foster has the right first move. Of course, going here immediately does nothing. White just queens, and then what is our queen doing out here? Check, he's running. Check, he's blocking, and white is safe, right? So we obviously need the queen a little bit more involved than it is on d1. So the right way to start is this move, queen g4 check. Now, white has a couple options. He can go this way, or he can go this way. And really, it doesn't matter so much what he does with the king. We're going to play sort of the same move in response. King d7 means queen d7 check, I believe. And king h8 is also going to mean queen d7. Actually, king h8 is probably a bit worse. We should probably go king f7 with this king. And then, yeah, I was a bit inaccurate here. Queen d7 is fine, but king g6 is going to delay us quite a bit. So we need a better move than queen d7. Of course, it's going to be the same idea that we've seen historically, where we inch the queen closer with queen f5, king g7, queen over to g5, and now king h8 is actually a bit of a mistake. And we'll see why in a little bit, but let's stick with king f7 for now. And sorry. And after king g7, actually, okay, with the queen on f5, we've gotten the queen close enough, and now we can enact our checkmating idea. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. So now, finally, black can step to e6 with the queen on f5. When white queens, guess what? This move is check. King f8, for example, means queen e7 check, queen f7 mate, and king h7 means the absolutely stunning move, king f7. And this is a position you should remember well, because this is the key idea for black to win. Black steps to the f7 square, and now, believe it or not, there are no checks for white that are useful. All of them are covered by the king and the queen, and there's no way to stop checkmate either. There's no way to stop it. If the queen escapes, queen g6, or sorry, well, this is checkmate in 1. I saw this one, but yeah, checkmate in 1 is pretty good as well. And yeah, that's it. That's the game. There's no stalemates. Actually, that one would be stalemate, but we take with the king. So there is one stalemate, but you just take with the king. Queen f8 check, you take back with the king, and it's over. So how do we get here? We start with queen g4 check, king f7, we go queen f5 check, king g7, and now king e6. And we have this killer idea of queen g5, king f7, winning the game. Now what happens if king h8? I said this one was a little bit wrong. Well, here we can actually just transpose back to what we had immediately with queen f5 and king e6. There's also queen d7 here with the idea of an early king e6 and checkmate on f7. But simplest is probably to stick with the idea that we know, which is queen f5 and king e6. And queen g5 check, the key move here, with king f7 to follow. Really, really cool stuff. So that's why stepping to either of these squares is enough for black to win the game, because from either of these squares, you can get to f7, and that's the critical idea that wins the game for black. Getting to f7 with this mating net is the key point. So why do these two squares also work? You obviously can't get to f7 from here. It's a bit too far away. But of course, the chessboard symmetry is coming to bail us out once again. Not only is stepping to f7 enough, but stepping to g6 is enough to win as well. So for example, if we had this position, if I can triangulate here, okay, black to move in this position, right? Once again, these are the squares we need to get the king to in order to win. The king can step to f5 from e4, so this is going to be a winning position as well by the exact same idea. Only in this case, we need to put our queen on the e6 square rather than the f5 square that we saw last time. So how can we go about doing that? Well, queen d8 check, king g7, for example. Sorry, king f7, for example. King g7, for example, is a bit better. And once again, there are multiple ways to do this, but if we stick with the idea we know, we can do this, queen here, and now king f5. And it's the exact same thing, only with the position of the queen and the king reversed. Promote to a queen. Once again, this idea doesn't work, to check and mate, and this idea runs into king g6. Okay, so this is the pretty complicated one. This is complicated stuff here, I'm not going to lie. But the key thing to remember, right, going to the initial position, black is winning if his king is in this box because he can step to these four crucial squares that win the game for black. Why are these four squares crucial? Because we can set up this idea of putting the king on g6 with checkmate to follow, right? Or g6 or f7 with checkmate to follow. Why isn't d4 winning? Well, d4 isn't close enough for the king because, of course, the king cannot get to any of these squares. That's why we get this weird sort of asymmetry where these squares are all close enough, but d4 is not good enough for the black king. Okay, so questions on this. Questions on this. There should be questions here because this is complicated. So Shalene, if you take a look earlier in the lecture, I explained why when the king is super far away, this one is not winning, because white, of course, can stalemate himself in the corner. Please stop touching my face. Can't help it. Force a habit. Also, that's not a question. What if more than one pawn versus the queen? Stay tuned for the puzzles at the end of the lecture, learner's point. Why can't we follow the same zigzag checkmate technique with the rook pawn? Earlier in the lecture, I promise I covered that. Once again, I will very, very briefly go over it. I don't want to repeat myself too much. But the point here is that we cannot do the zigzag because when we get close, here, when the king steps in front of the pawn, we cannot step up because the white king is stalemated, right? Okay, let's move on then from the rook pawn. Once again, these 4 squares are the key squares the king needs to reach. If the king is close enough to step to one of those squares, then this square, of course, included in our little perimeter here, then black is winning with this idea of putting the king, sorry, that's not the right move, king g4 check, with this idea of putting the queen on the opposite square, right? Putting the queen on the opposite square. Very quickly, though, I do want to take a look at what happens, for example, if the king is here. Sorry, not here, even as far as here, right? Now the king cannot step to e6, but it can step to e7, and the winning technique is going to be exactly the same, right? It does not matter that the square is a little bit more awkward, unable to reach the comfortable square of e6. You can still go queen f5 and king e7, and there's no practical difference between these 2 squares for black because the square we really cared about was f7 the whole time, right? It's exactly the same winning idea. Wanted to mention that as well. So one last time, these squares are important because from them, black is able to reach f7 or g6. And I think sometimes getting to these squares might work, but that's a little bit silly because why would you put yourself in a square where your opponent can promote with check? No reason to do that. And from any square where you can touch these squares, you can also touch the squares 1 file back, just by the nature of the chessboard. So black wins on this perimeter because he can touch these 2 critical squares, and from there, he can get to f7 or g6. That's the idea. That's the idea. Now, let's take another look at the bishop pawn, okay? So, who knows some rules about the bishop pawn? This one is even more complex, I would say, than the rook pawn for when black is going to be winning with the king. The trick is somehow different with the bishop pawn. Well, there's sort of just more tricks to understand, which makes things a little bit complicated. If king on h8, then draw. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. So, what is the evaluation of this position? Sorry, I was catching up with chat and I forgot to tell you guys what I was asking. Sort of just getting acclimated with the position itself. Aniruda doesn't know yet, which is perfectly fair. People are suggesting a move, which is also perfectly fair, but there's no evaluation. I don't know if they think it's winning or not. I have is saying that this is a draw, but then he's saying never mind. So black to move. I'm sorry. Black to move here. Learner's point says draw question mark. So this one is actually going to be a victory. And the idea is going to be very, very similar. We want to step closer with our king. So king f5 here, right? Now, if white's only 2 legal moves are king g7 or king g8, let's say king g8 is his choice. And now the point is, after queen g5 check, the drawing idea was to step away from the pawn, pointing out that we can queen, or you'll have to put us in stalemate, right, by capturing. But thankfully here, black can do better. So black to move and win, and this position. This is the key point. Black to move and win. And yeah, the chat room has it. You have to go king g6 in this position. And we have another tricky checkmate. White now queens, and there's even a little bit of separation between the queen and the king, but we have now checkmate thanks to the move queen h4 or queen h5 and queen h7, when this queen is a traitor and has blocked the king, put him in a little coffin, so that this is actually going to be checkmate with no escape route available to him. So, in order to win with the bishop pawn, we need to be able to reach g6 to win the game. So what does this mean? Well, let me set up the position with white to move. Sorry, with white to move here. It means that this position is actually going to be a draw if it's white to move, because white steps out of the way, we don't have time to get to g6, and as soon as we start checking, then king h8, and this idea is going to be good. King g7, or king g5 rather, is not enough. f8 queen, check, and the king is escaping. And we don't like the king escaping, our king is too far away. So this starting position is winning because we can get to g6, right? The key is being able to get to g6. Now, do we care about this other side of the board? Do we care if our king can get to e6, for example? What happens on the long side of the board? This is the king on the short side. The key square on the short side is to get to g6. But what about this long side? Who knows about the long side of the board? Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the long side of the board and see what is going on here. So black to move and win. Is the king close enough? Well, I guess I just told you. The king is close enough. And let's take a look at what happens here. And oh my goodness, thank you so much, Sean, for the $10 in the chat. That is too kind of you. What's wrong with queen h6 then king g6 first? Let me take a quick look and then we'll get back to it. Let's say here. Yeah, this is also perfectly fine with queen h7. Also perfectly fine, chess king. Okay, back to this one. So it turns out that the black king is actually close enough. And the reason is not the e6 square, as you might expect. On the other side, it was g6, so it might make sense to think that it was the e6 square. But black is winning here because he can get to the e7 square. This is the key point. We go king d6, king g8, and now after check, white either has to block his pawn, which is an easy win that we've seen before, or step away, and now we have the key idea of going king e7 and stopping this pawn with our king while the queen keeps the king out of play. So, in general, on the short side of the board, you can get to g6 and play for this checkmating idea, and if your king is on the other side of the board, getting to e7 is going to be enough for a win. And now, this would be about, I think, equally as complicated as the ideas with the rook pawn. It's still this checkmating idea, or on the other side of the board, you can't really play for checkmate because white runs away, but you can get to e7 and stop the pawn. But there's one more critical idea with the bishop pawns to think about. And that brings me to the the first puzzle of the night, and the most difficult puzzle, but I wanted to give it to you guys. Black to move, what's the evaluation of this position? And what is the best line? Black to move here, what's the evaluation of this position? This is a bit complicated for beginners. Well, I wanted to sort of cover this pretty thoroughly here, So the beginning part, that's what's important for super beginners. But this part is also pretty interesting, and if you can understand this, then you understand everything, I think, about these queen versus single pawn endgames. Chess King says draw. Cat Wi-Fi says king b5 or a queen move. I have says win for black. Well, how? You guys got to explain here. I just finished telling you the g6 square is important. Not going to get there. And the e7 square is important. Probably not going to get there either, right? So how on this planet is black going to win this position? Right? One move is not enough here. One move is not enough. Need a winning line. And now, this one is complicated enough, and I don't want to spend the rest of the lecture just sitting here waiting for the chat to figure it out. So if you guys are in the chat right now, thank you guys so much for thinking about this puzzle. I would very much actually encourage you to go ahead and pause here, even if you're watching live, and try to figure this one out, because it's worth thinking about. And actually, as I'm saying that, someone in the chat does have it. So if you do want to think about it more, I encourage you to pause right here. It's a really beautiful idea, but black is actually winning in this position. How is black winning? Well, black is winning with the idea king b5. Now what? You know, you're saying to yourself, like, what are you talking about? King b5? How? That's not, like, of course getting the king closer is nice, but like, what does this matter? Well, it matters because immediately white cannot get to this other side of the board. So what should white do? Well, white should try and promote his pawn, right? King e8, try to promote. And now, if black goes back sort of to usual business here and tries to check the king, now white should actually, believe it or not, run to the king's side of the board. If black tries to get closer, then the idea we looked at, king g8, is good enough for a draw. Black is not getting to e7, and white can stalemate himself in the corner and draw the game. However, black can do better in this position than something like the usual queen e3 check and bring in the king closer. And how can black do better? Black can do better with a critical move, queen to g6. Now if king f8, king c6, and the point is, white cannot come stalemate himself in the corner because this queen, very crucially, is guarding the g file still. So, king f8 not playable, but king e7 seems playable. And now, finally, the critical idea again is queen g7, pinning the pawn to the king, king e8, and then black to move and win here. We're not going to go for a repetition. We're not going to give this check, allowing white to go for this stalemating idea again. We play the move king c6, and after queens, queen d7 is checkmate. And that is the beautiful idea that allows black to win this position. So there's one more little rule for you guys that I want to keep in mind, that I want you to keep in mind. If black is stopping white from getting to the corner for the stalemating idea, black is winning if and only if he can get to the c6 square. Obviously, these squares also get the job done as they are closer, but c6 is the square that's critical for black if white cannot reach the h8 square. So that is just an extra little puzzle for you guys to figure out there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I do have one or two more puzzles for you guys if we have the time. Here's a puzzle with the rook pawn. So obviously we saw that it was a draw when there was one rook pawn on the board, but now I have introduced the idea of a second pawn. So black to move and win in this position. Black to move and win here. What do you think? I'm not going to ask you the evaluation. Obviously, black is winning somehow. Otherwise, I wouldn't show the puzzle. So, black to move and win. What do you think, chat? Black to move and win. Let's hear some ideas. Okay, one idea is king c5. King c5's been thrown out. I just hovered over a few moves, by the way. Don't worry about those. Some of them are correct, some of them are not. King c5 has been thrown out. If the pawn was on a rank below, then queen b3, queen c2, queen c1 would win. I think you are mixing up the coordinates a bit. You're thinking about queen g6, I think, rather than queen b3. Zigzag the queen. Zigzag the queen has been suggested. Queen f1 exclaim or queen f5 exclaim has been suggested. So let me throw a wrench in the works here, fellas. all right, and ladies, fellas and ladies, there's only one winning move. There's only one winning move, okay? Actually, only one way to win this position, which seems paradoxical at first, right? You might not expect that. So the winning idea can be discovered by examining a similar position. So I will introduce that position next, but here I want to show you guys what the main idea is. So queen g6 actually doesn't get the job done. White is just going to be promoting this pawn, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, right? The best you can do is come take the guy. Let's say by some miracle, white even plays, okay, you can't make white play king h8, otherwise it's checkmate, and that is the real idea. But, you know, by some miracle, even if you won this pawn for free, it would still be a draw thanks to the rook pawn on h7 and the king being too far away, right? We're not going to get to those critical squares. We're not in our perimeter here, and so it would be a draw. But the idea of queen f5 actually is going to be enough to win here. The point now is if a7, queen to f8 is a checkmate. But, you know, white can try a bit harder with king g7. However, black can still weasel his way in here with queen g5 check. Let's say if king to h8, then it gets really, really simple, really, really quickly. And finally, white is stalemated on the king's side, but this pawn is now playing for black. See a7 and queen f8 mate. And if king f7 here, then the winning move is actually the same idea we've seen show up in other versions of this endgame. We use the queen's diagonal powers to force the king in front of the pawn, because now, you know, we're not forcing the king in front of the pawn and stalemating it. We're forcing the king in front of the pawn, taking advantage of the a pawn and checkmating it. So queen h6, using the diagonal ability of the queen, is enough. King g8, queen g6 check, king h8 to keep the pawn, queen f7, and mate. By the way, if the king comes this way, it's never going to be enough. You're never getting over here to this pawn. You can stop it in its tracks. So this position is winning with queen f5. Now I hear you guys at home. You're saying, wait a second. If queen f5 is winning, what the heck, dude? Why not queen f1? It's the same idea. You just weasel your way up there and then you win the game, right? Wrong! Incorrect! King g7 draws the game here. If you try this idea, king f7 is going to be the move. If you try to keep coming up the board, king g7, queen g4 check, and now white to move and draw. Who sees white to move and draw here? This is the reason why. This is the reason why. This is not the way to go. And yeah, the idea, as Peter Peterson says in the chat, is not king h8, when you would be running into this exact same problem of queen f5. This is actually the same position as if you had played queen f5 on move 1. But king h6 is, believe it or not, the drawing idea. What's the point? Well, generally, when the king would run so far away, we could put the queen in front of the pawn like this and sort of laugh in his face. For example, I guess this would be the most accurate way to do it, preventing king g7. But now a7. And if we go queen h8, believe it or not, now this is a draw. Why is this a draw? White to move and draw. Again, who knows? Who understands? Yes, you stopped me from playing. You blockaded my pawn successfully. Good job. But as we're already over time, I'm going to ask you guys at home to pause if you want to figure it out. The idea is white king queen. We take this guy, king g7, and uh-oh, now the stalemate tricks are back. White has sacrificed this pawn, and the position is drawn. If we tried to be tricky and play queen f4 check, hoping for king g7, queen g5, eliminating king h6, white goes king g6. And this idea of a7 and a8 sacrificing the pawn is now unstoppable. So really interesting position here. Queen f5 wins the game. Queen f1 does not, because because white has this very clever idea of coming to the 6th rank and drawing the game in that manner. I wanted to ask you guys about one more type of position, which I'm going to just put on the board manually here. Let's say you end up in a position where you have your king super far away, but the pawn's not on the 7th, the pawn's on the 6th. Can you win this position? Question for the chat here. Final question, and this is a bit easier than the last one. The last one was a pretty tough puzzle. From which book are these puzzles? What do you mean from which book? The book of my brain. Yeah, I did come up with these puzzles myself. That's not to say they haven't ever been invented before. Probably they have, because there's only 2 pieces on the board, and it's tough to do anything original with 2 pieces on the board. But I did come up with these on my own, for what it's worth. So Learner's Point asks, what if there are 2 or more connected passers versus the queen? In general, those positions are always going to be winning. The reason these are sometimes drawn with 1 pawn are these stalemate tricks. With 2 connected pawns, as long as they aren't on the 7th, obviously, then the queen can usually blockade, get in front of the pawns, and once the queen is in front of the pawns, it's sort of hopeless for white. Obviously, there are exceptions, but as long as you can get the queen in front of the pawns, then the pawns are usually immediately immobilized, and the game is over. So Danilo says, yes, you need to put the queen on A8, and that is pretty much close to the truth. However, there's one more idea that we can borrow from the previous puzzle that will make our winning task all the much more easy. So, for example, if queen d7 check, king b8, for example, queen b5 check, king a7 would allow us to bring the king closer, and then win the pawn. So if king b6, trying a bit harder to hold on to this pawn, then queen c8, a7 doesn't draw because we can blockade the pawn. And for example here, queen c7, king a8, now it is actually going to be mate in 2. Black plays any legal king move, and then a7, queen c8, checkmate is a great idea. So easy win for black if the pawn isn't on the 7th rank in this case, right? There's no stalemates for white, and instead white will be in Zugzwang and have to move the king away to the a8 square, or allow the queen to the a8 square. And once the queen is on a8, if I can find this line again, b6 for example, queen here, a7, a8. Now it's simple, there's never threats of queening the pawn, and we bring the king up at our leisure and take the guy for free. All right, any final questions on these queen versus pawn endgames? I think I covered almost everything there is to cover, if not everything there is to cover about these things. Hopefully you guys have a good understanding now of how to win these endgames, and maybe at least are a little bit aware of these more complicated cases where the pawn has some tricky business, or the king is just barely close enough to catch that pawn and give checkmate. Any final questions for me before we call it a night here? All right. Well, in that case, I am going to call it quits here for the YouTube channel. Thank you guys so much for joining me for these 2 lectures this Wednesday night. The fun will continue on the Twitch channel with Analyze Your Games, the class where I analyze your games. Makes sense. But if you're watching the video version, the rerun version, thank you again for watching. I have had a lot of fun showing you guys these puzzles and these ideas in queen versus pawn endgames. That's it for me here tonight. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.